All right, thanks everybody for being here this afternoon after a little bit of a delay and some things turned upside down, but aptly, this is a panel on political risk and managing risk and some difficulties, so that shouldn't have been any struggle for us. We're going to keep things pretty simple. I'm going to ask each of our panelists one question, and then if we have some time, we can open things up for discussion. But let me start all the way down on the other end. Our first panelist today is going to be George Papadimitriou, country manager for EY Greece. So George, let's kick it off with you.
Sure.
I wanted to ask you, I'm going to have you give me some broad brush strokes, right? Then I'm going to swing over to our friend Catherine here. I'm going to ask Catherine to give us, properly introduce her, but a picture more on the political side of things. Going to go to Carlo to talk about globalization, and then I'm going to come over and we're going to talk a little bit more about how things work inside companies. So George, if I might ask you, tell me about what you think are the biggest 10 kind of geopolitical matters that leaders need to be thinking about today. How are you thinking about them in your firm? Where should we be keeping our eyes open and looking towards?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kristin, and all of you for staying till late for this panel. Let me start by saying that geopolitical risk is on the high side, right? We have seen indices like GeoQuant that indicate that since 2017, geopolitical risk is keep rising. But we can also see on the public document references that in 2022, for instance, geopolitical risk references were 600% increased versus the past. And this trend was elevated as well in 2023. So to start, this is really something important for firms to manage. So what are the top geopolitical events, the way we see it as EY? I will try to do it in 8-9 times. I'm not sure if I will make it.
It's not easy, right?
But I will do my best. So the first thing is what we call geopolitical multiverse, right? In the past, it was a very easy play. The geopolitical arena was a very easy play. You had the US, you had the Soviet bloc, then you had China. So the dispersion of power was basically two big blocs in the world. Right now, we have the big powers. You have US, you have Russia, you have China. The tension between them is still there, so the strength was not improved. But on top of that, you have the so-called swing states, right? You have now peripheral powers like Turkey, like Indonesia, like Brazil, like Saudi Arabia, that they do what the title says, they swing. So they don't align with one bloc per se in everything, but on different matters they could align with different actors. So India would align with US on security, but at the same time they will play with Russia on energy, and the same Turkey and others. Then you have a number of so-called small rogue states, right? That they see this geopolitical tension and they think that they can solve problems. We have seen Azerbaijan getting it on Nagorno-Karabakh. You have seen things in Africa and many others. And you have as well the non-state actors like Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis that add to this dispersion of power. So the whole play is much harder to navigate because the actors are many. There's more volatility in the dispersion of power globally. The second key theme that we see is what we call the geopolitics of AI. So, 99% of the CEOs that we survey say that AI will be an investment priority the next year. We know that the states are in a dual race right now. On one hand, to invest in accelerating AI within, though, in their domestic countries, and on the other side, to regulate in a way that it will not become totally uncontrollable. We see that the states see AI as an important geopolitical tool. They believe it's important for national security. They believe it's important to get the promise of AI to improve, the healthcare, the productivity, the economy. So we see more and more tension and antagonism over AI. So we know that, US will keep having export controls or investment restrictions on things that are important on the value chain of AI, namely mostly on semiconductors, where they have the lead. On the other hand, obviously, China will strike back with restrictions on other parts of the value chain, which is critical minerals on which they have a more strategic position. So in all, we expect that this kind of game will strengthen the so-called technology blocks and will force swing states to align more with one of the big powers. The third thing that we see as an important geopolitical event is the domestic challenges we have in US and China. The sum of US and China is more than 50% in many, many angles. Whether we take the market cap, it's more than 50%. Patents filed is close to 70%. GDP, a bit less than 50%. So we all understand how important is this challenge that we currently see within these two big economies. For different reasons, in the US, we see a society, polarization, we have elections. We know that a thin lead of one of the two and, a division of power between Senate and House could lead to legislation issues, as we saw in the past. They have totally divergent views between them. So it's a risk, and where things will go, depending on what you believe, one of the two sides for you is a risk or an opportunity. On the other hand, China is expected to land expectations of its people and of its business from almost 8% growth in the past to 5% over the last year, which is not easy. They test different policy mixes. They have the challenges on the real estate, macroeconomic challenges that they had not seen in the past. So it's an interesting as well play there. So how these things will evolve is really important for the global geopolitical situation. The fourth, and I will be very quick on that, is that we have a super cycle of elections globally. 60% of the GDP globally and 50% of population goes in election into 2024. So I mentioned US in November. This is one of the last. We have European Parliament in the June and many other important states that go into election. Obviously, the result of these elections will determine many things from industrial policies, stance on climate. It will have an effect potentially on the war in Russia and many other important for the planet issues. The fifth key trend that we see is what we call the prioritization of national security, right? So we have seen in the recent years that political rivals' interdependency was much higher than it was anticipated in the past. And obviously, this sense of interdependency, that was more than the appetite of many, led to the other side of the pendulum, which is focused more on self-resilience, on self-economy prioritization. So we have seen a lot of trade restrictive measures, policies, investment restriction, export controls, and we believe that in strategic sectors, we will continue to see these things over the 24 and the years ahead. Very close to this theme is what we call the diversification agenda, okay? Very close to this prioritization of economic security. And this is that, pressure from the states, either through incentivization or pure mandating their companies to come closer to home, whether this is the supply chain or the production or other important aspects. This is through pressures to onshore, to nearshore, or as we say, to friendshore lately. And we believe that these pressures will continue to be so in 2024. A very important seventh item and theme is what we call the geopolitics of the oceans. The oceans is a really important theme because from many angles, if you wish. More than 50% of the population lives close to the ocean. 95% of the global trade goes through the sea. 95% of the data flows through underwater cables, contrary to what we believe, maybe some of us, that it is through satellites, Wi-Fi or other things. And all these cables are just 500 in the planet. All the cables that are 95% of the data flows. On top of that, we know that we see tension in the oceans when it comes to sea transportation. We have the South China tension with military, exercises very, very periodically. We have the Red Sea events with Houthi. We have the Black Sea. So many important sea avenues right now face issues. So we believe that from that angle, that will be very important for global trade and will have potential repercussions. There is also another interesting angle, which is that we expect the deep sea mining to progress more over 24 in the next years. And the importance of deep sea mining in critical minerals is really there. So with 67% of the global floor of oceans not belonging to any national jurisdiction, you understand that this is another source of tension and play. Number 8, very quickly, competition for commodities. Competition on 3 things. 1, critical minerals that power EV batteries, important for transition. Competition for food, a rising sense of insecurity when it comes to food, already export controls from many countries to preserve their food, and competition over water. We see more and more water-stressed regions and water-stressed countries year per year for many reasons, including climate change. I close with 2 more important themes. One is the dual-track green policies. We know that over the last years, we have seen many economies and governments backpedaling when it comes to green policies due to the macroeconomic challenges, due to the energy efficiency and adequacy issues. So this will create some tension between trading partners because they will perceive that some are more strict than others, creating competition issues. But also we could see more political activism, right? This is something which is in the heart of many people. So the sense that things start to de-accelerate could create political risk and tension from people. And I close with the climate crisis imperative, which is really important from my perspective, which is that despite the efforts the last 30 years to control and mitigate climate crisis, the truth is that the last 8-9 years, the situation worsens year per year. We see more cyclones, more floods, more wildfires, more extreme events. And the truth is that we'll continue to do so, right, to see these things. And big events, especially when they take a toll on human lives, come with huge political risk. And people from Greece know how big political risk can be linked to these kind of things. We could see more migration related to these effects of climate crisis, and we could see reactions and political risk arising from the fact that people will realize that the envelope, the financial envelope needed to address now the big effects of crisis is not really there. So I try to run quickly, but this is a summary of the top 10 things.
This is a good top 10, and I think some good food for thought to kick us off. So thank you very much, Mr. Papadimitriou. Much appreciated. In the context of this big top 10, I want to turn to my colleague at the European University Institute, fellow at the Robert Schuman Center, Catherine Fieschi. I'm going to get it right this time. So Catherine, you've written a lot both about, you've done polling work, but you've also kind of done a lot of consulting work. You've written a very interesting book about polarization in society. So if you think about some of the top 10 that we've just heard and the work that you've done, what would you tell us about how domestic societies are kind of, how they're responding to this new changed climate for geopolitical risk?
Right. Well, I think it's a great segue. You alluded to the fact that this is a bumper year for elections, and the ones that we're thinking about most prominently right now are the European elections, and then of course the American elections. And in some ways, the European elections aren't affecting the American ones, but I would argue that, the shadow of the American elections looms in some ways over the European elections. And I think that this really permeates the way in which political decisions are being made, or as the case may be, not being made, because everyone is, in a sense, holding their breath. So I think what's really interesting is that, I've done a lot of work centering on how domestic publics respond to the kinds of pressures that have been building up. And of course, populism and, this kind of mobilization right now, it makes all the headlines, but the fact is that it isn't particularly new. It's been rising steadily, but now it's having, it's having not just an impact, but, the numbers are really quite staggering. For example, if we take a place like France, a movement like Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National essentially stands at roughly twice, the score of the current president. And then, of course, if we look at the numbers coming out of the United States, we have, another sense of a very much a looming crisis. And in the context of this, of course, we have to add the fact that for the first time in a very long time, even though we'd had military conflict in Europe, we can see that war is back. So what's really interesting, aside from despairing, what's really interesting is that whatever political decisions get made at the moment, when we try and respond to the IRA at a European level, when we try and disentangle or figure out our relationship with China, for example, it all feels like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, because we're faced on the one hand with a major security crisis, and on the other hand with a transition, and we need to find, the money to face both, and it feels like a huge trade-off. But I think that, just to finish on the domestic side, what's interesting about the polling that we've done in terms of domestic audiences, it's quite clear that in Europe, people are worried about the American elections. They're worried about the American elections because because they've seen Trump won, and they'd really rather not see Trump too. They know that this would have an even worse impact on support for Ukraine than, you know, the kind of stalemate that we're seeing now. And so, you know, this is a real preoccupation. The other preoccupations really are all about the cost of living. And actually, you know, Ukraine is, you know, probably fourth, fifth as a preoccupation. So what's very interesting is that I think what we see in voters is that they perceive this growing uncertainty. They see the dangers, of course, from what's happening in Ukraine. But really, the main conclusion that they're drawing is that their elected politicians have not been able to sort out the crises that they are faced with. And this is one of the things that's really striking about the polling that we've done, is that, you know, many of us who are Europhiles and some of us who are Eurocrats, we sort of congratulate ourselves on the way that, you know, we've come together for Ukraine, and oh, didn't we do a great job in the end vis-a-vis COVID, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, if you poll European citizens, they don't see any of this as a success, right? They see this as the European Union failing them, and they see this as their national governments failing them. So this is one of the, I think, you know, one of the key points that we need to take on board. Voters are worried. They're not attributing the blame necessarily where the blame needs to be. They can see that, you know, Putin's responsible for a lot of this, but really they are blaming, you know, their own political leaders and their own European decision makers for what feels like uncertainty and for what feels like, as you said, crises that have not been resolved. And I think, you know, the Green Deal, the way that, you know, the backlash that we're seeing against the Green Deal here is emblematic of this, you know, something that is reshaping or attempting to reshape people's lives, a lot of money spent, a lot of regulation, something that feels very intrusive to voters, and they are, you know, and they are really recalcitrant about this, and it's still getting worse, right? So everything feels as though it's getting steadily worse, and the people who are getting blamed are the decision makers.
Super interesting, and I think, you know, in the logo, kind of lingo of political science, the way we talk about this is the idea of compounding shocks. And when you go, though, kind of zoom out, you get a sense of how much of this is attributable to forces just of globalization? And where are we in terms of thinking about globalization and all of this? Because I'm sure many of us on this panel, maybe not everybody, but many of us could remember the heyday of globalization in which everybody was very enthusiastic. And now we might be reaching a point in time in which there's a bit of cynicism. So I'm going to turn to my friend and colleague, Carlo Altomonte from Bocconi University, who doesn't just know a lot about globalization, but especially a lot about trade. And we're also launching a new course together on political risk, which I'm excited about. So Carlos, let me turn it over to you. Thank you, Catherine, very much. I think this is really coming together really nicely. Carlos.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks to the survivors for making it until here. Clearly, we all know that even before COVID, we got a backlash in globalization. I mean, if you think about Brexit and you think about the US-China trade wars, they were all signals of a fatigue of globalization, which in the end was driven by the fact that the gains of globalization were falling disproportionately on very few, and the losses on, let's say, unskilled blue workers in our society. So that is all clear. If you want, COVID gave another blow to that, because it signaled even to companies that there were critical nodes in the network, and therefore fragmentation was and blockade of production were a critical risk. So you wonder what is of globalization nowadays. And we hear all this pressure about reshoring and friendshoring and strategic autonomy and so on. But if you look at the data and if you look at the markets, that things are not there. No. maybe because the data are late, I don't know, but if you look at how markets are responding to the current geopolitical uncertainty, zero. Stock markets are at the highest levels. Profit margins are holding in the US and Europe to a certain extent. So what's going on?
Yeah, it's ETFs and what's going on, like what's driving all of this,
yeah, exactly, right? So there's one thing that many people misread in the data, and that is what I call the curse of averages, right? Basically, when we look at global trade data, we sum the world exports and we divide over GDP, or we sum the GVC trade over total trade. And yes, we do see some flattening, and we do see in the last years even some drops. But what if we get rid of China in those world data? How would the world look like? Well, the answer is that if you don't measure China in trade data, and you just look the trade data and the GVC data of all the other countries in the world, the line is upward sloping and continue to be upward sloping. So the world is not getting less globalized than before, if you exclude China from the picture. It's China that is getting deglobalized from the rest of the world. And that's not even something you can blame China for. China is becoming, I really am very skeptical when I hear the emerging economy. China is an advanced economy, full stop. And being an advanced economy, it has a trade openness that is getting closer to the trade openness of the US and Europe. And when China moves from 30% of trade to 18% of trade, the world gets less global, because China is 1/3 of the world, and maybe even more than that in terms of trade. So at the end of the day, what we really have to think about is that there is an underlying trend where global trade flows are holding steady. I'm not saying they're increasing or accelerating, but they're holding steady. And there is a part of the world, which is China, which is getting closer and more integrated within themselves. Now, one would argue, first, should we still build resilience around those integrating trade flows? And the answer is yes, for sure. Eventually, getting rid of your China exposure. So build strategies that you can call China for China, where you invest in China and stay in China, or China +1, where you differentiate. Apple has recently shown in the data that the production of iPhone in India has, I think, reached the same levels of China recently. But if you think about it, building resilience in a network means more trade, not less trade. Because what you were doing in China, now you're replicating in other parts of the world, and there might be more bilateral trade rather than less bilateral trade. So the network is getting, by definition, denser. And that means more trade, not less trade. So we should be very wary of how we look at those international statistics.
And Carlos, just to clarify, we're talking about trade in goods here,
yeah,
right?
Goods.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm coming to
that's
yes,
what I thought.
exactly.
No, I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't want to rush you, but I like where you're going, just in terms of thinking about goods, services, information.
There is one other thing, however, which is getting more fragmented, and we do have evidence, which is changing the nature of globalization, and that is capital flows. So we have had trade and capital flows growing at the same pace, capital flows even quicker, international investment growing even quicker than trade over the last 15 to 20 years. Just to give you statistics, there was around $5 trillion of foreign multinational capital invested in the world as a stock in the early 90s, and we are now at 45 trillion, so 9 times more, or 900% increase, which is astonishing. It's an exponential. Okay, that thing is slowing down, for sure. So what you really have to ask yourself is what happens when trading goods or services remains, but the backing up of capital flows is not there anymore. That is the question, I think, that we need to start asking ourselves to check and see whether and to what extent the world is resilient to the new nature of globalization that is happening.
Super interesting. And so just to say, ask one kind of quick follow-up question on this trend that you're seeing in terms of capital flows. What are the primary drivers?
Again, China.
Again, China.
There has been, China has attracted 200, roughly, if you sum China and Hong Kong, consider, say together, if people allow me to do this quick calculation, because if you think about foreign direct investment, you go to Hong Kong because you want to go to China, I guess. China's been attracting, on average, over the last 15 years, excluding COVID, $200 billion of investment per year. That's roughly $20 million per hour, just to give you a sense of it, okay? Every day, every hour, in the last 15 years. Okay, that is over. That is over. And therefore, the implication of it is where do we get the backing up of this resilience financially? How do we change the plumbing of the financial system behind that? Because this is going to have consequences. This is going to change the way financial flows move, possibly with the emergence of other centers that are not the traditional ones, Dubai, Singapore, being very much in the radar screen, as new centers where the new flows of capital were going to meet the trade flows that is moving around.
Interesting. This is great. So thank you, Carlo.
No
I'm going to turn to our kind colleague, Kelly Papadimitriou. Yeah?
Good try.
Okay. And so from REBORRN. And Kelly, I understand that you, okay, we've heard a lot. We've heard this kind of big picture, domestic politics, flows of globalization. I've understood that you kind of work with companies to help build resilience in the context of all of this.
Yeah.
So what do you tell the people that you talk to? What are the strategies that you advocate? And then with the 3 kind of remaining minutes that we have left, I might ask our panelists that exact same question themselves. If they have any kind of key takeaways when you're working with the private sector in this context, what are the sort of strategies and wise words of advice that you pass on? So
Yeah.
Kelly, please, over to you.
So yeah, let's turn the spotlight a little bit internally into the organizations and how they can be more resilient with all those changes, and very interesting insights that you all shared. So indeed, what we have seen with our clients that are multinationals, big global companies that have employees like across different regions, different cultures, and of course they need not only to react, but also predict and be as proactive as possible with all those changes. So what we advise and what we have seen actually working is to build a very, very strong culture, organizational culture. This means that everyone in the company has a very strong identity of the purpose and the values, and they have this sense of belonging with the company, especially when we're talking about companies that have employees across the world, and you need to handle crises between countries that are in war currently, right? Or there is tension. You need to ensure that there is, first of all, culture competence, there is care between the employees, between the leadership of the company, that everything is in place, and be prepared for the unpredictable that we have seen happening in the past years. So having this robust culture in place means also that you are very, very ready, and you have built those communication channels and communications strategy. So yes, I mean, crisis management frameworks are great. And we have all, I think, have seen how they are, like they live in the drawer, and when time comes to put them in action, they are not the proper ways to handle a crisis. So having those, having culture, but also having the means, the channels, the agility to communicate transparently, very quickly with all the employees, not only to share like updates, but also share how you take care of your people that may be affected, so that people feel this from the company, but also to actually help. I have a great example from a client of ours and how they handled the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, and how they were very quickly to react to help employees that they had in both countries, actually, and to help them in practice in very tangible ways, like whoever wanted to leave the country, to help them, or financially, and of course to be very, very mindful of the fact that they wouldn't be productive for maybe their lives would be at risk, and how they kept the whole organization actually updated about those actions and what is happening with their colleagues and their teams, and of course the operations in those countries, and how they quickly shifted their focus to their other operating plans. So it's really important to keep that in mind. At REBORRN, we also have a very diverse workforce. We're only 50 people, but we come from different countries and even cities in Greece. So we ourselves had to face this kind of difficulties. So I think that this is the most important part, and to ensure that actually, because you cannot predict, right, what is going to happen, but you can be flexible on how you will respond to those challenges, and be, of course, empathetic. Bring the human element forward. Given that you have built as a manager the relationships with your teams, to ensure that you are there to listen, to help, either psychologically or practically.
It's interesting because what I kind of hear in your points is a little bit a movement away from this obsessive productivity culture, which seemed to be very central to firms. I think in many ways emanating from the Silicon Valley model, charting your time, having apps to basically make sure you made the best use of every day, to more towards a resiliency culture, to make sure that even maybe if people are not at their absolutely most productive, at least they're not going to depart from the firm entirely, because there's more of a, as we know, that kind of churn and burn